Hello, everybody. Welcome to Libertarian Front. I'm your host, Joe Palmetto, a political science major. Also have a law degree, great interest in international politics and politics in general. If you saw my last video, I talked about the leak Trump plan to end the Russo-Ukrainian war, and it's really been on my mind a lot lately, and I wanted to talk about it a bit more. So in the last video, I compared this war between Russia and Ukraine to the American venture in Vietnam. And you can also think back to the 1980s. So the Vietnam War was 1960s, 1970s. And you can also think back to the 1980s when Russia fought a war with Afghanistan. Now, both of those wars, maybe not Afghanistan so much, but Vietnam, at the very least, was a proxy war, right? Where the United States had supplied support to the South Vietnamese, who were anti-communist forces, and the communist forces in North Vietnam were supported ostensibly, materially, and ideologically by China, a communist nation, and the Soviet Union at the time. So the United States begins by sending assistants, military advisors, and eventually the United States sends their own troops to South Vietnam in order to fight the North Vietnamese. And the war went on for many years. I mean, some people, by different estimates, you could say 7, 8 years, 10 years longer, right, that the campaign went on. The United States lost many tens of thousands of American lives, and the Vietnamese likely lost millions of lives in that war, and eventually the United States pulled out and stop fighting. And that was a proxy war. And the current war in Ukraine is also a proxy war at this point in time, right? Pretty much all of Europe, Western Europe, and many other countries around the world are sending military material aid and money to the Ukrainians to battle the Russians after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So it's a proxy war, right? Russia is fighting Western forces overall, although it's primarily Ukrainian citizens who are doing the fighting, defending their territory. And, I made that comparison. But I think we have to think about this war a little bit differently, because this war is actually a much more dangerous hot war than that other war, the Vietnam War. And it's even a much more dangerous war than Afghanistan. So let's move the map over to Afghanistan. Okay. And, at the time in the 1980s with Afghanistan, the Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan were actually part of the Soviet Union. So in many ways, this was bordering Afghanistan, right? But Afghanistan was bordering the Soviet Union, but not quite the way, not in quite the same fashion as Ukraine borders the heart of Russia. And that's one of the points I wanted to make about this being a more extremely dangerous hot war than Vietnam or Afghanistan. The thing with the Vietnam War was that Vietnam, while it borders China in the north, obviously, it doesn't border the United States. So the United States is fighting this war in Vietnam. There was never any real risk of the United States using nuclear weapons to fight this war in Vietnam. I mean, look how far away Vietnam is from the United States of America. Now, it is close to China. It obviously borders China, and the Chinese did a lot to support the North Vietnamese. But I don't think anybody really thought that China was going to use nuclear weapons or that Vietnam was going to use nuclear weapons. And there was no real threat of the Vietnamese or the Americans invading China, even if they did win the war. Now, Afghanistan, 1980s, another proxy war, right? I'm talking about proxy wars here. the United States sent limited material assistance to the Mujahideen, the guerrilla fighters who the United States would end up facing themselves only about less than 20 years later, from the end of the Russo-Afghanistan War. But there was no real threat here. Like, Russia had already basically occupied Afghanistan. The Afghans were fighting a guerrilla war with material assistance from the United States. There was no real threat of Afghanistan, let's say, penetrating the borders of the Soviet Union, and certainly not what I would call the core of Russia, which is this Moscow area and hundreds of miles around it. Now, when we're talking about the Ukraine war, okay, this border here, and I'm sorry, I can't make my marker highlighted, but you can see Kyiv, you can see Kharkiv, okay. This border is very close to the core of Russia, which is the Moscow area, St. Petersburg, up here. And while Russia chose this war, and it is certainly a war of aggression, in my opinion, on the part of the Russians, this war has much more dangerous potential than those other wars because it is so close to the core of Moscow. And for Russia to lose this war, okay, they themselves could risk losing territory to Ukraine. Additionally, the Ukrainians are already attacking inside of Russia proper multiple times, and the Vladimir Putin and the current government in Moscow is likely sees this war as life or death. Basically, if they were to lose this war, they would lose their power, their grip on power in the country. And this war has turned into a much more deadly war, at least for both sides combined, than the Afghanistan war or the Vietnam War. Because in the Vietnam War, as long as it went on, okay, the United States actually didn't lose hundreds of thousands of soldiers. I mean, they had over 100,000 when it comes to injuries, and wounded and deaths, but nothing like the sort of meat grinder that Ukraine is putting to Russia. So because of the proximity to Russia and Ukraine, I believe that this war is much more dangerous. It has a much greater risk of spilling over or turning into some sort of nuclear interaction. Although I do believe that's low, I believe it's very possible, than those other wars. And just imagine, if you would, if the United States was fighting a war with Mexico and had crossed the Mexican border and it appeared that they were losing. What would the United States do in a situation like that? I mean, what would they be willing to do in order to win such a war? Probably exactly what Russia is doing, which is mobilizing millions and millions of people. And I think you really have to think about it on those terms. I mean, the United States, imagine fighting a war with Mexico right on its border. Okay, the United States would all of a sudden become extremely dangerous. And Russia, even though they created this situation, is extremely dangerous. So I think that that's one reason that the world should really think about whether or not they want to put an end to this war, because even though I understand wanting to deter Russia and other powers from good old-fashioned land grabs against their neighbors, this is one that's really, really dangerous, especially if Moscow believes that they are losing the war. So when Trump comes forward and the media makes it out like this big deal, this may have been a controlled leak. I think the Trump may have wanted this to get out. And here's the truth about Donald Trump. Like, even if this came out, that doesn't mean that's what he's going to do, right? And the alleged plan that was leaked is that Donald Trump would give up the Crimea and part of the Donbass region to Russia in exchange for peace in the war. And at this point, it seems almost inevitable that something like that is going to happen. Whether or not do we have four more years of war just to get to that same result? Because it's really starting to appear to be a war of attrition with very dug-in lines similar to World War One. And if you really study World War One, the only thing that stopped Germany in World War One was essentially a complete societal collapse. I mean, their resources and functioning were just pushed to the absolute limit. And I can tell you, Russia is nowhere near that limit at this point. Nowhere. I mean, the Germans were just throwing human lives at both of these wars. I mean, Germany actually brought World War One. They actually brought Russia to its knees, which led to the Red Revolution and the Russian Revolution, communists eventually taking power, because World War One broke the Tsar, broke the current government in Russia. And Germany had moved very, very far east before they eventually lost to the Western powers. But the only thing that brought Russia down was essentially complete societal collapse. And that's the only thing that brought Germany down in that war. And the same is true of World War II. And so to think that the Ukrainians are close to quote unquote defeating Russia, I find it hard to believe. Russia's industrial capacity is immense. So this is an extremely dangerous hot war where Russia will feel very, very threatened if they are seen to begin losing to a large degree. Now, I think Donald Trump, I think there's other ways to end this war, right? Like maybe Russia doesn't keep all of its territory, okay? Maybe they just keep certain Russian-speaking regions and or the Crimea. For example, instead of, the vast swabs of like southern Ukraine, they captured areas of southern Ukraine that aren't in the Donbass region, but lost areas of northern Ukraine that are. So I think there's a couple different deals that actually are possible to be made here. Can include, Ukraine becoming a NATO member, Ukraine becoming a greater part of the European community, et cetera, et cetera. I think there's a lot of different things that can be done when it comes to making a deal to end this war. Now, I don't know that the Ukrainians, ultimately the Ukrainians have to be on board with it. And so does the majority of Europe. But it may be worth trying because this could turn into an extremely dangerous hot war. So I just wanted to make that point just to take the air out of the quote-unquote leak and those that would want to say that his idea is ridiculous or this or that, okay? I think you have to have all options on the table. And and maybe making a deal earlier in the war was ridiculous, but you have to think, too, that Russia has already paid a significant price. There's estimates that they've lost hundreds of thousands of soldiers, the money, the time. For what, a couple hundred square miles of farmland. They're now a bit of an international pariah. Although, they are lining up a pole that is separate from the West with a bit of a Russia-China axis. But still, is it worth all the lives that are being lost? So I think that the Trump campaign's plan or willingness to negotiate should be taken seriously and should be looked at. And I think Trump will be looking to position himself as a peacemaker. And, a similar deal was struck at the turn of the century between Russia. Look at that. They have the name for Russia way over here in the middle. Russia. Look how big it is. With Japan and the Russo-Japanese war and Teddy Roosevelt at the turn of the century, he negotiated. I believe it was before World War One, or maybe right after. I'm sorry, I can't recall. But actually, it was before World War. It was definitely before World War One in the 1900s. And Japan, Theodore Roosevelt stepped in, negotiated the peace deal between Japan and Russia. An exchange of territory was part of the deal. Japan felt like they got the rough end because they had actually won the war, and Russia saved a lot more face than I believe Japan felt that they deserved, considering Japan had won the war. But Theodore Roosevelt got the Nobel Peace Prize for negotiating that. And I think Donald Trump is looking to possibly set himself up in a similar way. So those were just some additional thoughts I had on the Trump peace plan for the Russo-Ukrainian war. I think we have to look at it. It could have been a controlled leak by the Trump campaign because he wants to put this out there. Even though he's vociferously denying this, maybe he wanted to put this out there. And even if he didn't, it's not necessarily a bad thing because because a lot of people are very nervous about this war, and they may think, hey, here's somebody who wants to talk peace. Because currently the United States position, the Biden administration, they don't seem to be too interested in negotiating at this point, and they prefer to just continue to feed Ukraine the weapons and support that they need to continue to fight the war. So thank you everybody for tuning in to Libertarian Front. I hope you learned something. I hope this gives you another perspective on this issue. If you like my content, please like, subscribe, comment, and share. I try to bring my knowledge to the table on international events and also speak from a libertarian perspective. So please leave like this video, leave a comment, share, do the free things that you can do to support my content. I truly appreciate it. I would like to grow this channel more on libertarian politics to come. Thanks. Bye.